So we are witnessing, as I said, some very interesting times when it comes to the bigger cycles of dominant empires. Currently, the U.S. is, well, for lack of a better term, has spent ourselves into oblivion. We have over 200 trillion in debt if you include our unfunded liabilities, and we're adding about $1 trillion every 100 days to the quote-unquote national debt that everybody watches. It's about 35 trillion. We're in numerous conflicts and wars, but we're more managing than really playing to win. And by 2020, the dollar has lost about 98% of its buying power since 1971. And even in the last few years after COVID, we've lost another 25% of what's left. Anyone who goes to the grocery store or compares prices just a few years ago can see that. So on top of this, our political system is about as unpopular, I think, as ever, with the lowest approval ratings in history. We've got a president who shakes hands with thin air. A case can be made that, we're weaponizing the justice system for political use. We've got over 10 million illegal immigrants that have come across our borders in the last 3 years. And groups like the BRICS are working to replace the dollar with their own currency for trade. So I know that's a lot, but how does this compare to the waning years of the Roman Empire?
So I think the interesting thing about this is, as I mentioned, I've been doing a lot of appearances about this since March. And I really hammered in on one area in time. And I think it's important for people to understand, first of all, that Rome is 3 eras in time. Because I think when people hear Rome, they just think of the Roman Empire. And, Rome was actually a kingdom first. It's a kingdom in 753 BC to 509 BC. And when we think of kings, they're likely not like kings like you would think of kings. They're probably more like chieftains or warlords. And from 509 to 31 BC, it's the Republic, so the Roman Republic. Then from 31 BC to 476 AD is the actual Roman Empire, and that's in the West. Okay. In the East, where Constantinople was, which is now Istanbul, it was the Roman Empire until 1453. And I think when people hear about the Eastern Roman Empire, often we're calling it Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire. And the important thing to understand is, though they were culturally very Greek, they would have considered themselves to be Romans. And that's what's confusing in 800 when Charlemagne, is crowned Holy Roman Emperor. It's confusing to the emperor in Constantinople because he says, well, I'm emperor of the Romans. How is there another emperor of the Romans? So I think it's important to understand that point when you look at the East and West Empire. Now, when you're looking at kind of where we are in things, I don't know when you're going to publish this episode, but it got a little bit more complicated last week with the trial against Donald Trump, because I've been talking about Rome's crisis of the 3rd century. Because if you look at where we are, that is very much where we are. So I'm talking about the year 200 AD to around 284, 300 AD. So right in that time period. And but if you look at what's happening with the Trump trial, that also denotes a fall of the Republic moment too. So we're kind of experiencing these two events at once. And I've been trying to wrap my head around it, Dave, because it feels like our political system and our economic system are aging differently, if that makes sense. So I think we're seeing these kind of two events happening at the same time. But if you want to look at the crisis of the 3rd century, the number one problem they have is inflation. By 284, there is 15,000% inflation. Another problem that they're dealing with is they just have immigration gone wild, and the central power is crumbling. And as I mentioned, the Western Empire ends in 476, so it lasts for almost another 190 years from 284 when Diocletian becomes emperor, and that's mainly because of his reforms. When Diocletian comes in, he tries to reform monetary policy, and he issues a new silver coin and a new gold coin. And he also changes how the military is structured to try and start handling the borders and things like that. So we do have kind of this reforming period that gives them a little stability. Diocletian is followed later on by Constantine, but you have the same problems after Constantine leaves in the West that you did earlier, where generals are basically raising an army, declaring themselves emperor, and spending into oblivion. So I can definitely talk about how we got there, but I know I've been talking for a bit, so I want to give you a chance to, I guess, kind of butt in and figure out where you want to go with this.
I think we need to unpack it, right? And I think we need to unpack it in what it means. We'll talk about this more as we go, but in the context of all right, I'm an entrepreneur with a business in this world. What does it mean to me? Because, inflation in the devaluation of the dollar is a huge thing for entrepreneurs. And that once you get into these eras like this, and at least from my study, like it just is like a snowball rolling down the hill. And it gets worse and worse and worse because once you're that far in debt, you have to create more debt to fund it with, and it just grows on itself. It's like a leviathan, right? There's like no way out of it,
Yes.
and then it ultimately crumbles.
Well, that's why they talk about bankruptcy. They're like, bankruptcy happens a little bit at a time and then all at once, right?
Slowly, then suddenly, right? Yeah. And so we get an idea of the errors